What do governments and businesses do when faced with the spectre of either missing the COP27 targets for reducing greenhouse emissions or meeting those targets while allowing businesses to fail and people to die in a cold European winter? There are no good options. At the end of each year, I usually spend some time studying a variety of sources so that I can come up with a view on possible future outcomes in business, politics, and society. Now, in this video, I take a look at what's likely to be ahead for leaders in 2023. And without making any fearless predictions, I give you some sense of where the world appears to be heading. Now remember, trend is your friend. So rather than just making judgments based on a snapshot at any given point in time, it's way more useful to see which way an issue has been trending historically. So from sources as diverse as The Economist, the Wall Street Journal, Australian Financial Review, Wikipedia, most reliable website in the world, and the Good Judgment website. I'm going to take a look at the macroeconomic drivers that will shape our leadership environment in 2023. I'm also going to summarise some of the perspectives from an outstanding lecture I attended at Harvard Business School in October, and I'll take a more light-hearted look at the new jargon we'll be using more frequently in the coming year. So let's start at the macro level. Now I just want to start with a caveat. Whereas it might seem like I'm offering predictions for 2023, I'm absolutely not. As Eugene Ionesco said, you can only predict things after they've happened. But having said that, I'm going to give you my views on some of the trends that appear to be emerging. Now, I mentioned the Good Judgment website. This is an organisation that uses super forecasters to predict what's going to happen in the areas of geopolitics and economics. It's a wisdom of crowds type of thing. Now, if you haven't come across the concept of wisdom of crowds, it was popularised in a book by James Surowiecki around 20 odd years ago. The central tenet is that if you take the average of opinions from a large sample of individuals, you're going to end up with a more accurate answer than any individual expert could predict on their own. So for example, try guessing how many jelly beans are in a large jar. If you were to ask a few thousand individuals with no expertise whatsoever in estimating such things, and then you average their responses, you'd end up pretty close to the right answer. And in fact, that average would be closer to being accurate than the guess of any particular expert, say a physicist who is expert in volumetric calculations of 3D objects. So this is why I like to look at the super forecasters' predictions in the context of the global macroeconomic picture. What are a few of the takeaways from them? Well, as usual, all eyes are on China. Will China's GDP growth return? Now, 85% of the forecasters think that China's GDP is going to grow between 2 and 5%. And almost 3/4 think its GDP growth is going to be above 3.5%. Not quite a return to the halcyon days of 8% year on year, but it shows some strong recovery nonetheless. And this is going to be an important factor in stimulating global trade. There are lots of predictions, of course, around the war in the Ukraine. Somewhat comfortingly, 95% of people don't think that Putin will resort to nuclear weapons in 2023. But unfortunately, 90% of forecasters also think that Putin is going to be able to hold on to power in the Russian Federation. Now, it's pretty broadly agreed that we'll be heading into a global recession in 2023. And there's a bit of a catch-22 here. Central banks have to look to higher interest rates to dampen inflation. But this has side effects, which are going to be felt in flattened consumer spending and increased unemployment. And in Britain in particular, the short but seismic Prime Ministership of Liz Truss is still having impacts. And the country's trying to build back some semblance of trust and credibility into the markets. For 6 straight years, gross fixed investment, which is a proxy for infrastructure spend, has risen as a share of global GDP to over 25%. And this is going to stagnate a little in 2023 due to lack of government cash. But despite this, global investment is going to be nearly $25 trillion. Now remember, governments propping up employment and growth can only last for so long. Sooner or later, you have to pay the piper. And I know Margaret Thatcher was a very divisive political figure, But she did succinctly articulate the conundrum that faces virtually every government when she said, "The only problem with socialism is that eventually you run out of other people's money." Now in America, things look a little bit better than they do in the UK and Europe. The interest rate hikes that the Fed has committed to are certainly going to push us into recession, but this is likely to be cushioned by the record low unemployment and strong household savings position compared to other countries. And how about the rest of the world? Well, the Gulf countries are absolutely booming. They're some of the few economies actually benefiting from sustained high energy prices. They're also taking on an increasing role as financial entrepôts or middlemen. Will the Middle East be the next Hong Kong or Singapore? 2023 is going to be a big year for them. India is also on the rise, and in fact, it's on track to overtake China in 2023 as the world's most populous country. And India has a bunch of other factors providing a tailwind for them. Now, India's buying cheap energy from Russia, which will fuel economic growth. Domestic investment is on the rise, and the world is looking increasingly to India to replace China as a source of goods production and manufacturing. Now, for leaders who travel a lot for business, the airline industry will rebound, but it still won't get back to pre-COVID levels because many business travelers are going to choose to do business remotely wherever they can. And of course, energy shortages will persist. Now, some of the previously planned closures of fossil fuel generators are already being postponed. The lack of energy security in Europe is at the core of this. And unfortunately, this is going to further impact our decarbonisation plans. This is a really interesting issue that demonstrates the complexity of the wicked problem that is global decarbonisation. What do governments and businesses do when faced with the spectre of either missing the COP27 targets for reducing greenhouse emissions, or meeting those targets while allowing businesses to fail and people to die in a cold European winter? There are no good options. I had a reunion at Harvard Business School in October just gone. Now, I actually find it really hard to believe that it's 15 years since I sat in those rooms debating the merits of the case studies we'd analysed. It wasn't just pre-COVID, it was also pre-global financial crisis. Now, one lecture in particular was incredibly insightful. It was from Professor of International Management, Rawi Abdullah. And in just over an hour, he gave a fantastic overview of the changing world order. So I just want to reiterate some of the key points that Abdullah made in this lecture. Interestingly, his view is that we won't return to the global economy ever. Well, not the one we grew up in professionally at least. And we don't really know what's coming next. Now, like me, he didn't make any rash predictions, but he outlined the trends that show the repeat of a well-established cycle. And that is the cycle of the rise and fall of great powers. And he talked about the share of global GDP that different countries held at different stages of the last century and a half. Now, I didn't know this, but in 1870, China led the world in share of GDP, with almost 17% of all economic output. India was second at about 12%, and the US and UK both had around 9%. Now, the rise of the US through the turn of the 20th century saw it massively outperform other countries. And at its peak in 1960, the US accounted for almost 25% of global GDP. The next nearest country was Russia at about 10%. So the US had unrivaled economic power. But by 2016, the US share of GDP had fallen to 15%, and China had overtaken it with almost 18% of world output. Now, apart from India at 7%, no other country even had as much as 5% share of global GDP. Now, as an aside, these numbers are adjusted for purchasing power parity. In other words, they take into account local pricing factors. And if you want to learn more about PPP, take a look at the Big Mac Index. And yes, I'm talking about the McDonald's Big Mac. That's just a fun way to look at the buying power of different countries. It started in 1986 as a tongue-in-cheek proxy to determine a country's purchasing power relative to its exchange rate. Now, the Big Mac is an incredibly consistent product, and it doesn't vary much from country to country. So when you compare the price difference of a Big Mac in any two countries with those countries' exchange rates, you can work out whether or not the currencies are over or undervalued. It's the equivalent of what economists call a basket of goods, but it's just simpler to compile and understand. But I digress. Let's get back to globalization. Now, one of the most interesting things that Abdullah said is only 40% of Americans think that globalization is a force for good, which means 60% think globalization isn't good. US citizens no longer believe in the system that the US built. So what's the likelihood of greater global integration going forward? Well, according to Abdullah, it's extremely low, less than 10%. What's the likelihood of a similar level of integration to what we've seen in the past? Well, that's pretty unlikely too, maybe 30%. So the likelihood that we're heading into de-integration of the global system has the highest probability by far, at around 60%. And for me, this is just a little disturbing. If you look past the hysterical sensationalism, globalization has been an incredibly positive force for good. It's lifted living standards massively all over the world. Now, don't get me wrong, there are still vast divisions of wealth, and I don't think any system's ever going to deliver that utopia of global equality. But if you look at the objective facts, it's indisputable that globalization has lifted over 1 billion people out of poverty in the last few decades. And the retreat from globalization comes at a time when countries in Africa and Latin America are best poised to take advantage of this global growth engine. It would be an absolute tragedy to see them deprived of the opportunity for economic prosperity that much of the developed world has benefited from in the last 50 years. But there's definitely a rising tide of populist backlash against the system, a deep sense of frustration with inequality of income and wealth. It's not exactly new, like this has been happening since the 1920s and 30s, but the populist backlash that we're witnessing all around the world with the macro environment is pretty telling. Marine Le Pen was narrowly defeated in her bid to become the president of France. And if it weren't for a few votes, the world order would already look different. Le Pen had clearly stated her intent to withdraw France from the EU. Add to that the microeconomic trend of disaffected labour, great resignation, quiet quitting, refusing to return to the office, all that stuff. And this hotbed of discontent is really unlikely to cool in 2023. Also, sadly, as a consequence of the war in the Ukraine, it's going to be a rough winter in Europe. So, for a start, we can expect energy shortages. And more broadly, as the supply of wheat exports from Russia and the Ukraine remain low, potential famine in poorer regions that can't manage through that price volatility. So Abdullah's conclusion went something like this. He made it really clear that the populist backlash we're seeing is aimed squarely at us, those who are perceived to be the privileged elite. Now, not many HBS alumni could mount a counter-argument to this fact, but ironically, we are also the ones who are most likely to be in a position to influence how the system works. So whereas we need to do everything we can to preserve globalization, the system does need a rethink in terms of how it works. And as leaders, we have an opportunity to be part of that rethinking. In the next 5 to 10 years, we can make a meaningful difference. Leadership is more important now than it's ever been in our lives. What would you normally expect to hear from a macroeconomist, right? Okay, well, that was all a bit serious and depressing, wasn't it? So let's finish on a bit of a lighter note. I want to take a look at some of the new jargon and language that we're going to see emerging with greater frequency in 2023. So I've picked up half a dozen of these phrases from a variety of sources. The first one is resilience hubs. Now this is the next level on from the concept of a cooling centre. A resilience hub is a safe place to go in a heat wave. So you can charge your devices or find someone to talk to. Some are going to provide education and social services, or maybe help people to find housing or food. The second term is a battery belt. Now, a battery belt is a hub for renewable energy developments. These things can be a little tricky. So if you look at a country like Australia, the best places to harness the wind and sun aren't necessarily the easiest places to get the electricity to market from. So this means renewable energy generation facilities need to be built in clusters. That way, the infrastructure that transports the electricity to where it's actually needed, sometimes hundreds of miles away, is economically viable. The third expression is Scope 3 emissions. And while we're on energy, this is a term that all corporate leaders are going to need to become familiar with. Scope 1 and 2 emissions are greenhouse gases directly released into the atmosphere by your company. They're basically a direct byproduct of your operations. But the concept of Scope 3 emissions goes one step further. This is the calculation of the greenhouse gases emitted by your customers as a result of using your company's products. Now, these emissions are going to be attributed back to your company's carbon footprint. In effect, your customers' Scope 1 emissions are your Scope 3 emissions. So clearly we can expect a bunch of double counting here, right? Now the concept's a little confusing, so let me give you a simple example. A coal mining company emits greenhouse gases from its own operations. So it operates trucks and drag lines and handling and washing plants, and it has to transport the coal to market. But the product it sells, the coal itself, isn't counted in the company's Scope 1 and 2 emissions. Why not? Because the product doesn't create any emissions until it's burnt by the customer. So, the steel-making company that buys the coal creates emissions when it burns the coal to manufacture steel. These are counted as Scope 3 emissions, and they're attributed back to the coal miner because its product eventually creates greenhouse gases. Now, unfortunately, all the accounting and measurement in the world doesn't help as long as coal and oil need to be burnt to produce reliable and affordable energy. Term number 4 is passkeys. Now, just when I thought I was getting on top of passwords and I'd learned how to use a password manager to prop up my ailing memory, passkeys are the next generation of digital security. They go beyond passwords, a new, more secure method of protection for your systems and data. A passkey is an automatically generated token that's stored on your device. It can't be guessed or forgotten, and it's protected by a biometric authorization like a fingerprint or facial recognition. Term number 5, productivity paranoia. Now, we're all going to become familiar with this term. According to The Economist, 87% of employees think that they're at least as productive at home as they are when they're in the office. But importantly, only 12% of their bosses actually agree. Now, this leads to paranoia on both sides of the equation. Bosses are paranoid that people aren't working as hard as they should, and workers are paranoid about showing that they are actually contributing fully. Which leads to the final piece of jargon, productivity theatre. Now, this is where workers go out of their way to demonstrate that they're actually pulling their weight. They indulge in performative work that's designed to prove their commitment and productivity rather than to actually achieve the objective of the work itself. 2022 definitely had its challenges, but I think it was an awesome year. We emerged from the pandemic and started to reshape what the new world of work and leadership actually looks like. We're much wiser than we were before we went into the pandemic. And we now get to lead our organisations with a newfound optimism. There are still a lot of reasons to be nervous or apprehensive or negative. But think about this. What if you made 2023 all about steering your people to the opportunities that abound in our post-COVID world? What if you could help them to unlock their own creativity and experience to win in a world that's still changing rather rapidly? Now that sounds like an exciting 2023 challenge to me.